Okay. Excellent. Okay. So I just want to begin by thanking everyone for choosing to attend this seminar today to talk about this rather unique educational institute, the Craibstone School of Rural Domestic Economy. And thank you very much to Ellen for organising. This paper is going to offer a little bit of background about Craibstone and the school's subsequent experiences with electrification. For those of you who don't know, and to give you just a bit of context as to why we're discussing Craibstone today, my PhD is focused on the relationship between Scottish domestic science colleges and the electrical industry in the interwar years. I'm particularly interested in the mediating role which representatives of domestic science colleges played between the electrical industry and prospective consumers, and the promotional work which domestic science colleges undertook on behalf of the electrical industry. The Craibstone School is quite exceptional, as it was the only institute dedicated to teaching domestic science education pertaining to rural housekeeping practices in Scotland, and therefore the school offers a unique insight into the experiences of early female adopters of electrical appliances in rural Scotland. Typically, the experiences of rural consumers of electricity have been neglected by historians, especially those in Scotland, which makes the Craibstone experience all the more interesting to explore. Incidentally, just so we all know where we're talking about geographically, Craibstone is about 6 miles northwest of Aberdeen. There were 3 larger domestic science colleges based in central Aberdeen, Glasgow and Edinburgh during the interwar years. However, these urban-based colleges predominantly focused on teachers, whereas the Craibstone School specialised in the making of the ideal farmer's wife. I want to begin by giving you a bit of background about the Craibstone School, just to explain its purpose and the context for its existence in interwar Scotland. The Craibstone School was actually established in 1923 under the control of the North of Scotland College of Agriculture, whose governors desired a school to educate the lower classes in rural areas and prepare them for domestic service. It was that it would be the daughters of crofters and farm workers that would make up the majority of the student body. For many of the young rural women, domestic service was their only option, although farm work did provide an alternative for some, and Craibstone was therefore designed to train women for both farm work and domestic service. The founding of Craibstone was enthusiastically supported by Scotland's Board of Agriculture and the educational authorities, who hoped that the founding of the school would actually help to stem the emigration of rural women to the cities and further afield to places like America, Canada, Australia. Throughout the 20th century, the continuous loss of population in Scotland's rural regions to the cities and in emigration was a primary concern for the government. The farm labour force was actually quite well represented among those making up a higher proportion of emigrants between 1924 to 26 than any other occupation. Rural emigrants frequently cited living and working conditions as their reasons for leaving. The reality of rural life and accompanying housing conditions was quite bleak. According to the Scottish Women's Rural Institutes, most women living in rural Scotland were contending with damp houses, smoky chimneys, a lack of piped water supplies, no access to electricity, and on a daily basis enduring quite arduous domestic labour. Life on the farm wasn't much easier itself. Expensive machines were beyond the pockets of most farmers owing to the depression of the 1930s. The Craibstone School was actually one of several schemes which was implemented with the idea of improving the quality of life for Scotland's. For the benefit of rural men, there were 3 agricultural colleges which had been established in Scotland by the early 20th century, including the North of Scotland College of Agriculture in 1904, which subsequently governed the Craibstone School. For women, the previously mentioned Scottish Women's Rural Institutes was established in 1917 and offered an opportunity to learn new skills and receive an education and socialise. Rural women could take practical agricultural classes in subjects such as butter and cheese making, poultry trussing, fruit growing and beekeeping through the Scottish Women's Rural Institutes. When the Craibstone School was founded, they could offer women a more formal education in these lighter branches of agriculture, as they were called, and also in domestic economy. Domestic servants were generally remained unmarried while they were in service, but the education from Craibstone was intended to be instructive for married life too. The governors considered the role of women on the Scottish farm to be pivotal and therefore requiring specialised instruction. Dr. George Smith, who was one of the governors of the North of College School of Agriculture, and the chairman of the Craibstone School Committee, claimed he pitied the lady of the house who found herself in charge with no proper training, and that it would be a happier and better educational world if the issue was resolved. On the farm, a wife was a working partner to her husband, and their roles, whilst complementary, were clearly differentiated, with women primarily responsible for the management of the home and family. The diverse range of responsibilities which rural wives and mothers were expected to take on is summarised in this quote, which is on the screen, from an article written about Craibstone by a representative of the Board of Agriculture, and this actually featured in the Scottish Journal of Agriculture. When one thinks of the part women plays in the rural household, and especially in the household situated on the small farm, one realises how much of the well-being and happiness of the rural community depends upon the manner in which the wives and mothers perform their functions. She is nurse, housekeeper, cook, laundrymaid, seamstress, dairymaid, poultrymaid, household treasurer, with social and political responsibilities to fulfil. Craibstone School was a small-scale venture. There were 3 instructresses who were responsible for providing training and guidance to the 30 students who could be accommodated in the mansion house on campus. The course of training lasted for 6 months, with students split into groups and rotated between instructive classes in household management, needlework, dairying, poultry keeping, cookery and laundry work. The students came from various locations across the north of Scotland, including the Aberdeenshire lowlands, Ross and Cromarty, Sutherland and Inverness in the Highlands. Some travelled as far as Orkney in the Northern Isles too. The country house setting and the live-in lady superintendent at Craibstone were quite typical features of domestic science training departments of agriculture and horticultural schools for girls, which were also running in England at the same time. Supporters of Craibstone claimed a girl who was trained at the school would become a very considerable asset to the farm and croft, and therefore her skills were better than any dowry that she could bring. Throughout the 1920s, the school prided itself on replicating life on the Scottish farm for students, although with vastly superior accommodation than what most students would have been used. In the mansion house, the heating was provided by solid fuel. Students used stoves for cooking that were commonly found in country districts, and attention was devoted to the preparation and cookery of ordinary farm and garden produce. However, from the 1930s, several factors disrupted the way in which Craibstone was run, which shifted the focus from replicating life on the Scottish farm to encouraging and campaigning for the modernisation and improvement of Scotland's rural homes. Significantly, at the beginning of the decade, a female governor was appointed to the college for the first time, and this new governor was also president of the Aberdeenshire Federation of the Scottish Women's Rural Institutes, overseeing over 100 institutes. From the beginning, the institutes had campaigned for better rural housing conditions. The organisation's founder, Catherine Blair, was involved in the 1919 Memorandum on Rural Housing, which was commissioned by the Scottish Board of Agriculture, and had sought to gather women's housing experiences from across rural Scotland. In addition to a new female college governor, a new lady superintendent took over at Craibstone in 1930, and during her long tenure at Craibstone, Catherine F. Boyd, who is sadly not featured in this picture, I don't have a picture of her at the moment, was committed to updating rural housekeeping practices at Craibstone. Boyd had been born and raised in rural Aberdeenshire, and on account of her upbringing, she claimed to have maintained a warm interest in rural life. Before her appointment at Craibstone, she was educated in domestic science at the Glasgow and West of Scotland College of Domestic Science, and then subsequently attained a teaching post at the Edinburgh College of Domestic Science. Boyd's drive to modernise Craibstone was undoubtedly shaped by her experiences in Glasgow and Edinburgh. Both of these colleges were using a range of domestic appliances throughout the 1920s, including electric stoves and vacuum cleaners. Soon the Craibstone mansion actually became electrified, despite it being very unlikely that a student would have come from or go on to live in a home which would be on the electricity grid. In 1934, a new laundry and dairy with up-to-date facilities were opened at Craibstone, and an electric cooker was hired from the Aberdeen Corporation Electricity Department. Patrick Ramsay-Laird, who was Secretary of the Department of Agriculture, declared Craibstone to be on its journey to become the Mecca of the womanhood of Scottish agriculture. Boyd actually was directly contradicting the ethos with which the school had started with, which had been to use as far as possible the furnishings and utensils which were used in the homes and farms where students would go on to work. Instead, Boyd was embracing electricity and appliances which were advertised as labour saving, and other domestic technologies which would have been out of reach for most rural dwellers. Where infrastructure was lacking and the cost was high, Boyd wanted housewives to press their local authority for improvements. In an interview for The Scotsman, Boyd explained the benefits of teaching women how to use electrical appliances at Craibstone. She understood the rural women to be eager to improve their lot and believed that electrical appliances were irrefutably labour-saving for the housewife. And she said in her interview, a little discontent with their lot in the outlying places or backward hamlets may be the forerunner of real improvements. An electric washer may be beyond her range in her own home for many a day to come, but it is not as well that she would know that such a thing exists and how to use it. If she can agitate long and perseveringly, a whole clachan may live to bless her for her much speaking. Revisionist explorations of the mechanisation of housework have demonstrated that in many cases, the introduction of electricity and labour-saving appliances into the home didn't actually save time that was spent performing housework, as chores which had been in the domain of husband and child were reallocated to the housewife, and other chores such as laundry became performed more frequently and to a higher standard with the use of new washing machines. Certainly in the interwar years, housework was emotionalised in adverts for household goods. After all, the housewife did not receive a wage for her labours. She was doing them out of the love for her family. It has been contested that in rural areas, unpowered changes to the home, such as the introduction of hardware and carpet to reduce the amount of floor washing and the proliferation of ready-made clothing and food, actually resulted in a more significant reduction in women's domestic labour than appliances which were advertised as labour-saving. Yet, in the interwar years, the electrical industry and the female-dominated consumer education group, the Electrical Association for Women, pitched electricity as a revolutionising force in women's lives. In magazines aimed at rural women, domestic appliances were presented to the machinery which was used by men on the farm, even though in reality, where the funds were available, they were much more likely to be spent on farm equipment or possibly entertainment like radios than on household appliances for housewives to use. But Boyd firmly believed that electrical appliances represented a monumental shift in material circumstances for women. While the press continued to report on the migration of rural women to the cities and further afield, Boyd claimed that women left the countryside for the towns because of the lack of access to electricity and modern amenities, echoing and bolstering the sentiments of her fellow campaigners in the Electrical Association for Women and the Scottish Women's Rural Institutes. And by exposing her students to electrical appliances and her rhetoric, what Boyd was hoping to do was to train quite a small army of campaigners for electricity in the north of Scotland in a bid to prevent further rural depopulation. Boyd's campaign to electrify rural Scotland caught the attention of Caroline Hazlitt, who was the founder of the Electrical Association for Women. In 1938, Boyd was invited to speak at the Electrical Association for Women's annual conference, which was taking place at Glasgow's Empire Exhibition. In her speech, Boyd blamed the prejudice and the ridicule surrounding domestic science to be the reason why the home had remained unscientific. The idea that you don't require brains for housework, I think, largely explains why the home, and particularly the rural home, has remained unscientific and still heaps the most diverse labours on the head of the overburdened mother. It is only as the keeping of a house takes its place as a profession of importance and equal in standing to any other business that it will get free from the association of drudgery and dullness, which in the past has hindered progress. Boyd's argument here is quite clear. She's basically saying as housecraft practices become more professionalised, scientific and electrified, the more empowering it would be for women. According to Boyd, rural women had a job and it was in the home, and what they needed to do the job were those tools to do it to the best of their ability. The professionalisation of housework relied upon the availability of electrical appliances, however. This is where Boyd's views differed slightly from those expressed by the principals running domestic science colleges in urban areas. Although the professionalisation of housework was celebrated in urban domestic science colleges, electricity was also championed for supposedly liberating women from the home, and electricity was the servant of the middle-class housewife and businesswoman. Electricity enabled domestic science students to take on formal positions as demonstrators and saleswomen in electricity showrooms in urban areas, which took women out of the home and enabled them to have careers, albeit in quite sex-typed roles. But Boyd's vision of an electrified rural Scotland entailed fewer women leaving for the city, resulting in more women staying at home to fulfil their duty as the ideal wives for farmers. The pinnacle of Craibstone's interwar electrification mission was undoubtedly the school's exhibition at the 1935 Royal Highland Show. In previous years, Craibstone had not chosen a daring display at the agricultural show, instead opting to showcase the needlework and the student crafts. However, in 1935, the school occupied 800 square foot at the event to display an all-electric farm kitchen and dairy and to sell produce which had been prepared using the kitchen. The show was actually held in Aberdeen that year, and it seems quite likely that the school felt the pressure to put on quite an impressive display. By comparison, urban domestic science colleges frequently made appearances at popular lifestyle exhibitions in Glasgow and Edinburgh, where they would perform cookery demonstrations. Craibstone's all-electric kitchen at the Royal Highland Show was a big hit with the visitors and the press. The demonstration reinforced appropriate and accepted gender roles on the farm while establishing the reputation of the school as forward-looking and modern. In one review in The Scotsman, they said, "The Craibstone School, the pioneer of home and rural education in this country, is alive to the need for the application of scientific thought of the conditions under which the work of the country homemaker is carried out. An all-electric kitchen is fitted up in which the students who are just completing a 6 months training at the school will cook and serve lunch and tea. Those who appreciate the importance of the part played by the rural homemaker in the economy of the nation will see how many, in days to come, the work of the women on the small farm, which has too long been hard and laborious, may become a real pleasure." Perhaps slightly optimistic. The students were seen to be embracing new technologies as they cooked and washed and used an electric sewing machine for spectators. Electrical appliances were seen to make rural housekeeping a lot more efficient and reduce the hard and laborious labour, which then gave housewives more time to spend on handicrafts and decorations to beautify the home. This was a truly novel exhibition at the Highland Show. The sort of electrical machinery and apparatus which had been previously showcased at the Highland Show was for use by men on the farm and not for women in the farmhouse. After the Craibstone exhibition, it became a lot more common for domestic appliance manufacturers to have displays at the Highland Show, which did more displays were attempting to address the needs of rural women. However, in reality, the all-electric farm kitchen and dairy was still quite a faraway dream for many spectators at the Highland Show. Significantly, the Craibstone exhibition inspired a follow-up display in 1938 from the Scottish Women's Rural Institutes, who chose to display an Old World farm kitchen along with a New World kitchen. And the reactions to this demonstration highlighted from certain factions in rural communities who wish to preserve the traditional, authentic rural farms and cottages and resist the streamlined all-electric kitchen. The Old World kitchen induced a sort of idealistic nostalgia among visitors who found the modern kitchen lacking in human interest. The romantic aspects of Scotland's national identity had long been dominated by images of rural life, especially the Highlands, giving the country its national distinctiveness. But these romanticised notions of the Old World farmhouse and kitchen were seen as an unhelpful impediment to the modernisation of rural Scotland. In 1938, one representative from the Scottish Women's Rural Institutes criticised a romanticised display of a traditional Highland home built with dry stone walls and a thatched roof at Glasgow's Empire exhibition. The reviewer pointed out that the Black House was actually nothing more than a rural slum, and there was nothing to sentimentalise about it. Yet the electrical industry came to understand that to avoid electrification being viewed with contempt, it had to be framed as a device which could fit seamlessly into rural life and as a tool which could enable the time to embrace those traditions particular to rural life, such as crafting, embroidery, and cooking traditional Scottish fare. Notably, by the 1940s, when the North of Scotland Hydroelectric Board took over educational electrical exhibitions at the Highland Show, they made a special endeavour to show home interiors which were recognisable as Highland homes, so as not to strike an ultra-modern note, which would have been incompatible with the aesthetics of a rural cottage. To summarise, what I hope this paper has demonstrated today is that early adopters of electricity in rural areas, like those in urban areas, had an agenda. For Catherine Boyd, electricity was a means to create discontent among rural women and preserve dwindling rural populations. Electricity could both professionalise and preserve the rural housewife's role. The ways in which electricity was sold convincingly in urban areas needed to be adapted for rural audiences. Too much emphasis on modernity was alienating to rural consumers who did not want to see their way of life homogenised by urban standards. In the case of the north of Scotland, electricity could not be seen as a disruption to the romanticised image of the Highlands. Thank you very much, all of you, for listening.